Okay, chapter 8. In 30 minutes. I don't think it's going to happen. So this is going to be one of those days where, I might have to read the book to make sure you're prepared. That's just week of prayer in general. Why week of prayer always seems to come on these like really heavy, long lecture days, I don't know. All right, so most of this again. So the first half of this is going to be parts of physio class, continuing towards that. So the main purposes of your respiratory system is to get oxygen to the body and to remove CO2 from your tissues. So ventilation is going to be breathing. Diffusion is the lungs to the blood. Transport of gases via the blood. And all those things there. So capillary diffusion, we're going to go over those in more detail. So here's kind of the overview. Air comes in through the mouth or the nasal cavity, goes down through the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea into the primary bronchi, which is then going to go into the lungs to the brachioles. And then you're going to have the alveoles and then the pulmonary capillaries, and then each one of those has a little network of alveolas. And that's where the exchange of oxygen is going to actually take place in these tiny little things. It goes from really big, zooming in, and then zooming in even farther. It says there are 300 million alveoli in your body, which is a lot. So the process of moving air in and out of the lungs is the transport zone and the exchange zone. Kind of already said those things there. Give Kate just a second to write that down. You good? All right, keep it going. So the lungs are suspended by the pleural sacs. So the parietal pleural lines of the thoracic walls be out there. The visceral pleura is attached to the lungs itself. And the lungs take the size and shape of the rib cage. I will say it is fascinating to watch my kids breathe. I know that sounds weird, but when you see a baby when they're first born and they've never taken a breath before, when my daughter was born a couple months ago, the moment she came out, everybody just holds their breath and waits and just hopes that she takes that first breath. And the first thing she does is, and you're like, hallelujah, she can breathe. Because there's always that just momentary, and most kids can come out ready to breathe. That's what when they're ready to be born, they're usually ready, but that's just that moment of, But also they're so little that you can see their lungs expand and contract so easily because their rib cages are super flexible too. So you can just see more in small kids than you can in adults. So air flows is what they call a pressure gradient. So atmospheric pressure is greater than the interpulmonary pressure. It will flow from the air into the lungs. So as you pull, it's actually making a pressure gradient. By expanding the lungs, you're going to have more pressure in the lungs, and that's going to pull air in. And then the opposite happens. When you push the pressure in, you're actually going to blow out by pushing out. So Boyle's law is what they call it, is gas volume. The gas container is inversely related to the constant air pressure. So we'll talk about that when we get to the atmosphere that you breathe at. For different levels. So if you train high, train low, the atmospheric pressure is different, so it's harder to breathe the higher up you hike if you're going to Yosemite. It's that way. So the increase of the gas volume is going to increase in gas chamber is going to then increase the pressure. Depressing is going to pull it out. So this is just kind of, so the Boyle's law is actually going to talk about how many things are colliding. So if you have a small container with 2 oxygen molecules, we'll just make it simple. And if that's a half a liter, it's going to be bouncing around there. They're going to collide more because at that moment you're at 400 milligrams of mercury. So they're just going to be banging around in there as fast as they can. Well, if you expand the pressure into a 1 liter those two are going to collide less, the two oxygen molecules will say. And so that would be at 200 milligrams of mercury. So lower pressure means less collisions. And then if you make the volume even bigger, the pressure again is going to go down to, let's say, a 2 liter. And so those two molecules are going to run into each other even less. So that's what they're talking about with Boyle's law here, is as the container gets bigger, the collisions and the amount, or the pressure is going to be less the bigger you make it. More collisions mean more pressure. So airway resistance, so the flow of air is going to differ depending on how much there. And we can actually take pressure 1 minus pressure 2. So pressure 2 would be what, as you're pulling in and out there. So airflow ventilation depends on the pressure between the two ends of the airway and the resistance of those airways. If you ever heard of somebody saying they have pneumonia, it means they have fluid in their lungs. And so the airway are resistant. It's harder for them to breathe because there's more resistance. Ideally, there's most of the time but there's not a lot of difference, but it can change depending on the size of the body and if they're sick or not. So that's one reason you're very tired when you're when you're sick. So pulmonary ventilation is an active process. It uses ATP. So the muscles that are expanding and contracting the rib cage there are using ATP to breathe. So you're expanding, contracting as any other muscle is. So the muscles that are used the most often is the diaphragm. And then you're also going to have the external intercostals in between rib cages muscles to move the sternum up and down. And you're all doing this right now without actually thinking about it. So as that expands the thoracic cavity in 3 different directions, or in 3 dimensions, expands the volume, and that's what allows us to breathe. So as lung volume goes up, interpulmonary pressure goes down, and then Boyle's law is going to take that pressure from one to another. Air passively rushes in due to that pressure differences. Forced breathing, like when we're exercising, uses additional muscles. So now you're actually going to use the scalenes, the sternocleidomastoid right there. The pectoral muscles, the scalenes are the ones in your back. Ribs are raised even farther so that to get more muscles are recruited to aid in respiration. Makes sense? You're breathing harder. So usually expiration is a passive process, and that's probably what you learned in your physio class. Is inspiration, as you're blowing out, muscles are just relaxing. Lung volume goes down, interpulmonary pressure goes up, air goes out of the lungs. Active process, though, when you're exercising or when you're purposely, like I tell my son when he's mad that I can't watch any more TV. He's 3. And he always seems to be like, I'm like, take a breath. And so that is still an active breathing that I'm trying to train him to do to emotionally regulate, but that is just part of it. So when you're doing that, the intercostals pull the ribs down. It also uses the latissimus dorsi, back muscles, quadratus laborium, front of the shoulder, and the abdominal muscles force the diaphragm back up to breathe faster. So as we say, breathe with your stomach. You've always used to hear, I don't know if anybody's ever done yoga or Pilates, where they tell you to breathe with your stomach muscles is to make it a more active process in the breathing. So the respiratory pump is the exchange of interabdominal and interthoracic pressure. Again, compressing, squeezing, pulling out, and which is going to hopefully increase the pressure, which is going to get the veins to compress and squeeze to get more of the blood back to the body. They call it a milking action of changing pressures assists in the atrial filling, the respiratory pump. And so here's what that would be in a picture there. So at rest, you have the atmospheric pressure, remember this one for later, is 760 milligrams of mercury. At rest, everything's going to be just that. So as it pulls out, you're going to have 756, so it's going to be lower. Air comes in. As you expand everything out, the interpulmonary pressure goes less than the atmospheric pressure. Air comes in. Let's see if there's any other ones here. Nope. And here's what that all looks like in a nice little animation.
Objective: to study about human respiratory system, respiration. Respiration involves the following steps. 1. Breathing or ventilation, by which atmospheric air is drawn in and CO2-rich alveolar air is released out. 2. Diffusion of gases, O2 and CO2, across the alveolar membrane. 3. Transport of gases by the blood between the lungs and tissues. 4. Diffusion of gases, O2 and CO2, between the blood and tissues. 5. Utilization of O2 by the cells for catabolic reactions and the production of ATP, CO2 and H2O, cellular respiration. Mechanism of respiration. Breathing or ventilation is the means by which atmospheric air is taken to the respiratory surface for gaseous exchange. The movement of air into and out of the lungs is carried out by creating a pressure gradient between the lungs and the atmospheric air. Human beings exhibit negative pressure breathing as inspiration occurs when the intrapulmonary pressure, that is, the pressure in the lungs, is less than the atmospheric pressure. Expiration occurs when the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure. Breathing involves the muscles of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. The diaphragm is a C-shaped, dome-shaped structure of skeletal muscles and fibrous tissue that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. The dome curves upwards, and the superior surface forms the floor of the thoracic cavity. Radial muscles, called as phrenic muscles, are present in the diaphragm. By the contraction of these muscles during inspiration, the diaphragm becomes flattened, increasing the size of the thoracic cavity. The contracture axis increases in 0.3 and causes scalene muscles and pectoralis increase the strength of inspiration.
Here's the extra muscles here that we're talking about.
Forceful inspiration, an active process, by the contraction of certain accessory inspiratory muscles, like the sternocleidomastoid, scalene muscles, and pectoralis muscles. Forceful expiration, an active process, is achieved by the contraction of the internal intercostal muscles and the abdominal wall muscles, such as rectus abdominis, transverse abdominis, and oblique muscles.
All right, we're going to keep going there. Take a quick standing break. We're literally just going to stand up and sit back down, take a quick stretch. I should have brought some coffee. All right, cruising along here. So a spiralnometer is a measurement. So this one, you can kind of see a picture there. I don't think I have a better one where they actually keep track of it. Now, when I went through chemo, I had my lungs tested every single cycle. So every 3 weeks, on the third week was always my low week because I did like 5 days in a row, and then I did like Monday. So after that second Monday, I had like sometime there, I would come back in and I would go to this. It was on the top of the thing. It was almost like an extra layer on top. Like you could see the roof a little bit. So it was like, it had the best view of the whole hospital. And so you could like see out, I could see it was Southern Mississippi University. It actually looked straight out to that. So I don't know why I remember that. But they actually put me inside of a box and then had me put this thing in my mouth. And they would do all kinds of different ones. They'd have me like hold my breath and then blow out as hard as I could to get my total lung, or to get my like vital capacity. So that would be like this one where they're blowing out as hard as they could. They would actually do these like short little like, and they were measuring the whole thing. So I've been through this a few times. And so here's just some basic numbers here is like the tidal volume is a normal breath of 50 milliliters. And then the inspiration would be 300 milliliters. The expiration reserve volume, so that's what's left after you blow out. And then the residual volume would be kind of the difference between those two. And then they'd have like your full capacity as you pull all the way in, your inspiration capacity, so how much you can pull from your residual to total. So that'd be 4,700 minus 13 gets you yeah. And so that was just an interesting one there. And I just liked how this kind of had a little bit of everything there. So you could do your whole blow out as much as you can, and then they inhale as much as you can. And then all this is done with that thing in your mouth. Oh, and they always put a thing on your nose. That was one that always annoyed me. They had this like little clip that would go over your nose. I'm like, this thing really isn't helping. But that's what they would use. So just the basic terms here. This is the one I would take a picture of, Kate. So pulmonary ventilation is the amount of air moved in and out. The tidal volume is the amount of air moved per breath, so regular breathing. Breathing frequency would be the number per minute. The alveolar ventilation is the volume of air that reaches the actual respiratory zone. That one's harder to actually catch. And then the dead space volume is what they call it here, is the volume of air inspired that does not leave the conducting zone. So the lung volume is measured by spirometry, and so you can actually get a degree in spirometry. So just something for you to think about if that's something that's interesting. And they would do the whole thing there. We're going to keep on going because I just don't have enough time. Same ones there. So we've kind of already gone over the gas exchange between the alveoli and capillaries. So you hopefully can remember that. At rest, you have between 4 and 6 liters of blood in your body is how much the lungs are going to get. When you get that right ventricle cardiac output, it's going to be the left ventricle. The low pressure is going to go towards you, or towards the lung. The pressure gradient is going to have it push towards the thing. And then here's what that looks like going towards the body. We kind of went over that yesterday to a degree. So it's going to diffuse across the capillaries, and there's 3 million alveoli. It's a very thin, anywhere between 0.5 of a milliliter to, I don't even know what that beta, very small of a meter. So it gets really, really tiny, really, really thin, and that's to maximize the amount of gas exchange that you can get. So each one of the ends of each of those tubes has these big circles, and then there's individual cells on the edge there. And then here is where that exchange happens around each of those cells. So red blood cells are scooting across here, and here's that membrane, and the diffusion happens across this tiny little area of oxygen going in and carbon dioxide coming back. There's other things in there, but that's the basics of it. Comes across that wall. So the pressures are going to be the total atmospheric pressure. The individual person has different pressures. Let's keep going here. So the one that they talk about here would be at sea level at 32 degrees Celsius is where you would get this. And we'll go over this a whole lot more later. This was my side rant, that the pressure is going to stay the same, or the amount of air stays exactly the same no matter what level you're at, whether you're at Miami or whether you're at Denver. Mexico City's even higher. What changes is the barometric pressure of milligrams of mercury, depending on the altitude that you're at. So the pressure is actually what changes. It's not actually the air is actually thinner. It's just the pressure is different. So Harry's law says that gas dissolves in liquids in proportion to the partial pressures. And the partial pressure gradient is the most important factor for involving those gas exchanges in your lungs. And then here's another picture, kind of the same concept here. So the atmospheric pressure is 159 approximately. The pressure at your alveoli is 105. The pulmonary artery is going to be at about 40 milligrams of mercury. And that pressure gradient is going to continue to push it across those areas. And we'll go over that picture in a second, a little bigger. So Fick's law says that the rate of diffusion is proportional to the surface area and the partial gas pressures. So you're going to diffuse a constant influence across that diffusion rate. And then here's what that would look like. Oh man, that is, well, it's actually crisper on here, so hopefully you can see that. But you can see the pressures here. So as it comes in, it's going to be about 40. And that's going to cause, as they're saying, 105 to 40 for CO2. And it's going to go through the heart, pushed out here. It's going to go through the muscles and then come back to the other atrium. And those numbers are going to go down as the pressure goes through. And that's partially why they say red and blue. So red has oxygen, blue has carbon dioxide. But also the pressure is different. It's higher in the red and lower in the blue. So here's, I love this one. So as the carbon dioxide goes, and so you can see here's, how much carbon dioxide as it's coming back, goes through the heart, gets oxygenated through the lungs, and now it goes out through the body. It's oxygenated as the red blood cells lose. The transition goes, carbon dioxide goes up as it comes back to the body. And that's basically what that's telling us there. Kind of already showed you the pressure gradient as it's going across that tiny little section in the alveoli there. And there's actually some math there. You don't need to know the math, but this thickness is very, very thin to be able to exchange across that little membrane basically between cells. So you can see there's multiple cells here, the membrane, and then the red blood cells over on this side. Keeping going. So the capacity of oxygen is going to be, so the O2 volume differs per minute of the gradient. So the gradient is calculated by the calculatory average or mean of the pulmonary oxygen, which is going to be 11 milligrams of mercury. 10 minutes. We are not going to make it. So the resting numbers here, just make sure you know what those are. The maximum oxygen diffusion capacity is going to depend if the venous oxygen goes down, the oxygen gradient goes up. And you can actually go by about 3 times that resting rate as you're exercising. Same concept here. So at rest, only about a third of your lung is perfused with blood, and the top 2/3 has actually less gas exchange than the top. But when you start exercising, that top oxygen actually goes up in perfusion, and that's how you get full exchange. So when you're at rest, you're actually only using the lower part of your lungs, which also makes it when you have pneumonia. My mom gets pneumonia a lot, so that's why I talk about it. Is she has a really hard time breathing at rest, and that's because gravity makes the fluid in her lungs go to the bottom. When you're at rest, that's the main part, so she struggles to breathe to get over whatever she has. We're going to skip over that because we got 10 minutes. And we've already kind of talked about the pressure gradients here of each part. So diffusion is about 6 milligrams of mercury. That's because the artery has about 46. The alveolar carbon dioxide, now we're only on carbon dioxide. So diffusion is about 6 milligrams of carbon dioxide. So the diffusion is about 20 times greater than oxygen, and the diffusion is allowed despite the lower gradient. So it's going through the diffusion's going across here as it slides. So it's greater on one side than in this artery, and that's why the diffusion happens. So the oxygen cascade. So dropping of the partial pressures of oxygen at sea level from dry ambient air tissues and into the venous circulation, draining to those tissues. I think you have a quiz question on that, if I remember right, so make sure you know that one. What's up? Welcome to Exercise Phys.
Doesn't your wife have swimming out here now?
Yeah, she just put the baby down.
Oh, okay.
She'll be out. She's driving down right now. She actually just texted me.
Okay. No problem.
Yeah, swimming in 8 minutes.
Swimming in 8 minutes.
Well, that's when her class starts. Oh, sorry. My class ends in 8 minutes. She starts in 18 minutes. My bad.
Oh,
So this is what they're talking about. As it goes into your lungs, it gets humidified, so the pressure goes down a little bit. As it goes into the alveoli and to the pulmonary capillaries, and then exchanges across to the blood, and then into the tissues. And here's what that would look like in a chart. So percentage in the air, and there's the number of oxygen in the air all the time as it goes all the way into the body. All right, some more numbers that you do probably need to know. You have a carrying capacity of about 20 milliliters of oxygen per 100 milliliters of blood. So that's about 1 liter of oxygen in and your whole body has about 5 liters of blood approximately. I mean, I know we're averaging there, but there's about a 1-to-5 ratio. 98% are bound to hemoglobin in those red blood cells, and 2% of that is dissolved into plasma. So that's where most of it's going there. So oxygen hemoglobin and deoxygenated hemoglobin. So the transport of oxygen is going to depend on the pulmonary oxygen and the affinity between those two. So high pulmonary lungs are going to go across that curve, and here's the picture of what that would look like. So it's that oxyhoming dissociation curve. We don't have time to unpack that too much here. So some factors there, the blood's pH. As we had earlier about your blood needs to have a specific pH for it to work. The more acidic, the more that curve is going to shift to the right. And that's the Bohr effect. I don't know if you need to know that one yet. Also your temperature. When your temperature goes up, it's going to change as you exercise. So an increased pH is going to make that curve a little more difficult to breathe. As it decreases, it's going to be a little easier. So the maximum amount of blood you can carry is between 22 to 18 grams of hemoglobin. And that's going to be at that 98-99% saturation. So it's dependent on how much hemoglobin content you have in there to be able, and like anemia is when you don't have enough blood cells or enough oxygen in your blood cells. So you've heard like some women, when they're on their time of the month, they actually are anemic. So my wife used to actually have to take some pills to help her not be anemic. All right, so carbon dioxide transport. So this is taking any waste away from the cells. So it's going to carry it out of the blood in 3 different ways. One, it could be dissolved as a bicarbonate ion. So that's a part of your ATP process there. It could be dissolved in the plasma, and it could be, the most common though, is bound to the blood cells. So you can travel or transfer about 60 to 70% of the carbon dioxide is in the blood and in the lungs. The carbon dioxide in water forms, and that's what makes carbonic acid, and that's catalyzed through anhydrase. Can't pronounce that one, sorry about that. And there's the chemistry of how that happens. Here's a little prettier version of that. So 70% is bicarbonate here, so it goes from your muscles and through the carbon dioxide and water in the white blood cells, and it's carried through, it goes through the lungs, and there's where that bicarbonate happens, and that spikes, it goes through within the lungs and exchanged out into the body. Couple more here before I let you go. So there's any other one of these here. I know that there's a quiz question I wanted to make sure you guys knew. You are going to have to read your book today, guys. I'm sorry to get this all correct here. So the difference between atrial and venous oxygen is a actual math problem there, and they can actually figure it all out there. We've already kind of talked about the 5-to-1 ratio of oxygen to blood. That can go a little, so at rest you have 4 to 5 milliliters, but then it can get to 15 to 16. Factors that are going to determine whether this is going to work as it should. Your oxygen content of your blood, the blood flow. If you're having blood flow issues, then you're going to have a harder time getting enough oxygen to your body. And then other local conditions like temperature and everything. So when it's super hot outside, it's harder to breathe and you overheat quicker and your muscles fatigue faster because they're not getting as much oxygen and nutrients as they need. CO2's exits through the cell diffusion and then is breathed out through the air. Your body's going to try to maintain their homeostatic balance with oxygen, pulmonary carbon dioxide, and your pH levels in the blood. There we go. Last one that I need to make sure you knew. Central mechanisms of regulation. So your respiratory centers are going to be at the brain stem, and that's where it's going to tell you how fast to breathe, and that's where your body's going to say go faster or slower. The central chemoreceptors are going to be stimulated through the cerebral stimulus with an increase in carbon dioxide in the cerebral spinal fluid. That's going to tell your body to increase the rate of breathing and remove excess carbon dioxide from the body. So that's how our body tells that it actually needs more oxygen is actually through the spinal fluid and those receptors in there. Some outside peripheral mechanisms would be the aortic bodies. Those are very sensitive to our oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen. And then there's some mechanical receptors that are going to be more the stretch. So as your pleura, bronchioles, and alveoli of the lungs are overstretching, it's going to cause an excessive stretch. And that's another way that your body knows to keep working harder to do that. And here's kind of how that chart would go. Sure, there's nothing other ones here that I know are on your quiz. You do kind of have a feedback from your exercising limbs. You'll know when your arms are a little sore that you're getting kind of more tired. Aerobic training has little influence actually on your respiratory system, is what this says. The older you get, the harder it's going to impair the recruitment of those pulmonary capillaries. If you have asthma, that's probably the one you're going to run into the most often, is if your client or students have asthma, they're going to have a harder time breathing. That's something I need to ask in every physical education class. Does anybody here have an inhaler that they need for class? And with the younger ones, I have to actually keep that in my pocket. As a kindergarten class walks in, you just get in the routine where, and I used to have to remember, I had two of them. So I had one kid, the boy is in the left, the girl is in the right pocket. So if they had an asthma attack in the middle of my class, they never have, thank God. But I had to, you don't have time to send them to the office during your class. All right, we're going to watch this one and then we are going to call it a day. Last thing.
2 panels. First panel, inspiration, artery, skeletal muscle, brain, and lungs. Second panel, expiration, lungs.
Breathing can be regulated and modified by the changing chemical environment in the body. Central chemoreceptors, peripheral chemoreceptors, and signals from active muscles can all stimulate the inspiratory center.
Text, stimulus, central chemoreceptors, PCO, pH, peripheral chemoreceptors, PO2, PCO2, pH, and signals from active muscles stimulate the inspiratory center.
These stimuli trigger contraction of the external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. increasing the volume of the thorax and drawing air into the lungs.
Text. Response. The external intercostal muscles of the
Gotta love
diaphragm contract,
descriptive
increasing the
audio.
volume of the thorax, thereby drawing air into the lungs.
This stretching of the lungs, in turn, triggers the expiratory center.
Text. Stimulus. The stretching of the lungs triggers the expiratory center. Response. The intercostal and abdominal muscles contract, causing the thoracic volume to decrease and force air out of the lungs.
In response, the intercostal and abdominal muscles contract, causing thoracic volume to decrease and force air out of the lung.
All right. Have a wonderful day. That is as far